I'm Lorilee Binstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Trauma Survivor Thrivers YouTube channel. This is your ultimate destination for the inspiring stories of trauma survivors and valuable wisdom to undertake in the modern world of COVID and the pandemic, where mental health is horribly neglected. Today I'd like to introduce you to the pride of Binstock Media Group, a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. Here is our very first episode about my why. If you would like to hear more, check out my podcast in the description below. ATSTPodcast.com/podcast. Also, I've launched a Patreon website for members to have exclusive access to me, as well as other perks, including an opportunity to interview me. You can find that link in the description below as well. I welcome all of your feedback.
The content of this podcast could contain triggering information that may not be suitable for some listeners. Discretion is advised. Welcome. My name is Lorilee Binstock, and you're listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. What the hell is a Trauma Survivor Thriver, you ask? Let me give a little background about myself and why I've started this podcast. I am a victim of childhood sexual abuse by my father, and I kept that secret and lived with the guilt and shame for more than 20 years. It almost killed me. 5 times to be exact. 4 overdoses and an attempted hanging. This trauma took place in my early adolescence and sent me into a downward spiral of self-harm, suicide attempts, substance abuse, hypersexual behavior, and abortion, and just risky behavior into adulthood. After my first suicide attempt at the age of 13, I pleaded with my mother to take me to a therapist. My mother worked in a hospital and told me that there was a chance someone in the medical field would know I was her daughter and could not bear the idea of being judged. I am Asian American, and mental illness is very much a stigma in my culture. So much so that not only was I not taken to a hospital when I overdosed twice, I was refused medical care by the very people who were supposed to protect me. I felt lost and hopeless, and at a young age believed the world was a disgusting and awful place. Some of my friends recall thinking that I was just insanely fun with a devil-may-care attitude, but I realize now that I just didn't care about dying. I was angry, defiant, and even tried to run away several times, sometimes for days, and when I was found, I was disciplined, spanked at the age of 13. When my father realized he couldn't put up with my quote-unquote bad behavior anymore, he left. I'm not sure where he went, but he was gone and I felt free. He would come back and leave, but was never home for more than a few months. His absence allowed me to be as reckless with my life as I wanted. My mother worked the overnight shift at the hospital, which gave me the freedom to throw almost all the high school parties I could. I was drinking, taking whatever drugs that were available, not even knowing what they were, bringing random guys home and just living each day like I had nothing to be scared of but life itself. I may have been the life of the party, but I was also bullied. I was called a slut and a whore. My parents' house was egged and toilet papered. My car and even my friend's car were keyed. Someone even spray painted "Lorilee is a slut" in my driveway. By the time I left for college in 2002, I had a moment of redemption, but post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, does not simply go away because you will it to. I learned that the hard way as a morning show anchor and producer in a small town in Virginia in 2007. After the stress of working an overnight shift with no sleep, my 4th overdose from sleeping pills sent me to a psych ward. I was diagnosed bipolar and prescribed to lithium. Eventually, I left the business and moved to Washington, D.C. with my then boyfriend, now husband, where we built a life together with 2 young children. We had our problems, but we went to counseling as a couple, and I also saw a psychiatrist and a therapist frequently. We just blamed my anger, depression, and anxiety on my bipolar disorder. My most recent failed attempt to take my life in February of this year, the moment when I hit rock bottom and then the bottom fell out from underneath me, was when I admitted to my husband about the sexual abuse. Leading up to the attempt, I had been severely depressed for months after spending the winter holidays with my family in 2019. It was the first time my children spent time at my parents' house with my father there. I was anxious when my husband wanted to go out because why not? My parents can watch the kids. I didn't think my father was a threat to my children, especially with my mother there, but I thought if my husband ever found out, he would never forgive me for letting our children near my father. That thought and that guilt played out over and over in my head until February. The moment I told my husband, I immediately felt a weight was lifted. My husband's support made me feel the most loved I've ever felt my whole life. Together, my husband and I made the decision for me to seek residential treatment at Sierra Tucson in Arizona. During a group session, my therapist introduced herself as a trauma survivor thriver. I was curious how one gets that title. My therapist said that being in treatment already made me a survivor of trauma. At the time, the idea of thriving seemed like a lofty goal. I was okay with the idea of just surviving, but here I am, a trauma survivor thriver with a little more healing to do. I believe it's the journey from a place of being a victim where the emotions and the pain from the trauma are still embedded in your life, even though the event is over, to then realizing that healing and recovery is a choice, facing it and choosing change and growth. I believe thriving is what happens when you realize there is much more to life than just surviving. For me, thriving was realizing life was worth more than just living, but finding a purpose. When I was in treatment, I went through numerous different therapies. I found out that I was not bipolar and that my symptoms that I've been living with for the past 20 years, all just PTSD symptoms. And so I did seek all those different treatments. And some of them are not easy to find on the East Coast where I'm from. I'm from Washington, D.C. There were residents at Sierra Tucson that didn't even know there were those certain therapies available just feet away, such as EMDR, neurofeedback, TMS, ketamine, and so much more. I read the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and Change Your Brain, Change Your Life by Dr. Daniel Amen, among many others. In residential treatment, there is a lot of downtime between therapy and a lot of recommended books. I was blown away by what I learned, not just about myself, but that there were so many different ways to heal. My question was, why doesn't everyone know about this stuff? I learned that all of my risky behavior, all of it, wasn't about me being a bad kid or a bad person, but they were all coping mechanisms I used to make me feel safe and loved after my trauma. Feeling like you are a bad person is so detrimental to one's development, but learning that those behaviors were symptoms of my trauma gave me new perspective. As one of my therapists said, "You are not special. These are textbook symptoms of this type of trauma." Throughout this series, I'll be divulging a little bit more about myself, so I hope you stick around to get to know me a little better and maybe find your purpose in life after adversity. I want to preface that I'm not a therapist. I've never even taken a psychology class in college. I was a journalism major, but my goal was to give a voice to people who had something to say. I did it through radio, television, and public relations. In treatment, I found my creative outlet through writing screenplays, touching on mental illness, and now in a podcast. As I've said, I'm no expert, but I know what questions to ask, and I'm here to find the experts and ask them for you. I hope that this podcast encourages you to take better care of yourself and others. There's always room to be better, especially to ourselves. If you have any topics you'd like to hear about or have experts you would like me to invite on a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast, please visit my website. That's ATSTpodcast.com. Again, that's the letter A, TSTpodcast.com. There you can find the links to my Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram page. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me and being a part of my podcast launch. Take care.